At the core of playing poker, there are 4 types of players you can face when you sit down at the table. There are loose passive players and loose aggressive players, tight passive players and tight aggressive players. Now in this episode, we are going to specifically focus on the loose passive opponents. And I'm going to give you 4 exploits that work extremely well against these type of players. But before doing so, let's jump into what tendencies these players actually have. These opponents, the loose passive players, they like to see flops. They are limping in a ton of hands. They only raise premiums if they do raise. And they are very passive post-flop. These players also are called calling stations when many people refer to loose passive opponents. Let's make it a little bit more practical and think about a hot example of how to recognize these type of players. If you think about hot stats for loose passive opponents, they have a high VPIP. As I told you, they want to see that flop. They have a low RFI. They enter pots passively if they do enter, mainly by limping or by cold calling. They have a very high cold call frequency, which is a big part of their strategy. They don't pay too much attention to their opponent's RFI range or position. And if someone will raise, they will simply just press the call button. And lastly, they have a very low 3-bet frequency. They only 3-bet the very best hands. And even with those hands, they often tend to take a passive action pre-flop. If you look at a hot example, which I show you here, I highlighted a couple of stats in this sheet here. You can see that on the top left here, we have the VPIP, which for this player is 58, a classic loose passive opponent, especially comparing it to the PFR, which is only 10%, and the 3-bet frequency, which is at 3.4. Now, in addition to that, they have very low RFI stats here for all positions, and the cold call frequency is extremely high, 74% here button versus cutoff. Okay, so this is a classic hot example. You probably recognize these types of players quite quickly, but it is important to do so when you face them at the table. Okay, let's continue, guys, and move on to the exploits that work well against loose passive opponents and that you have to keep in mind when you play against them. The first exploit you have to keep in mind is that you have to raise tighter if you have loose passive opponents sitting at the table. Now this might sound a little bit counterintuitive because yes, they play a ton of hands and their ranges are weak. But you have to keep in mind that the best result if you open raise yourself is that you pick up the blinds pre-flop without having to pay any rake. Now if these opponents sit at your table, especially if you have more than one of them at the table, the likelihood of you picking up the pot pre-flop is very limited. And therefore, you're gonna have to pay a rake almost always if you actually raise it up. Let me give you an example here of a situation where I have to think about what to do here. This is a situation where I am sitting in early position here with MP on my left here. Now, if we think about this situation and my general RFI strategy, I have to think about what is happening here at the table. And looking around the table and especially thinking about the MP opponent, his VPIP is 65. His cold call stat is 52. So he's going to do a ton of cold calling here. And I expect this player not to be that aware of, he doesn't really mind too much about what position he is in or against what range he is going to play. He just wants to see a flop with as many hands as possible. As long as his hand is reasonable, he's going to play the hand and he's going to make a cold call. So if I raise it up here from early position, I have to keep in mind that most likely MP is going to make the cold call, and I have 4 regulars sitting behind him and they can aggressively take up this opportunity to squeeze with a good amount of hands here and put pressure on me and on the recreational player in MP. So my general RFI strategy here, I have to tighten up here and I have to keep in mind that this will be the outcome extremely often, that the fold equity pre-flop is limited and that I will face a ton of squeezes here by one of these regulars because they will realize that the MP player is cold calling with maybe 50 or 60% of their hands. So they can put more pressure on him and on me therefore. Let's jump into the next example of exploiting loose passive opponents. And here we are talking about ISO raising in position. And I want to show here one example as well to illustrate what I'm talking about. In this situation here, I am sitting in the cutoff, and my opponent, who is limping in, I decide to raise it up here to 4.5 big blinds. And this is a classic loose passive opponent. If we look into his hot stats here, 48 VPIP. He doesn't raise too much, only 10% here. So he's going to limp in with a ton of hands here. And we have to make a decision in the cutoff. Now, generally, a good rule of thumb here is for raising versus a limper is that you're going to raise your RFI strategy from one position earlier. So for example, here in the cutoff, I would raise not my cutoff RFI range, but the MP RFI range. But I think you have to be a little bit flexible here and don't stick too much to only that rule. You have to keep in mind who is sitting left of you. And in this instance, there are 3 regulars sitting who don't necessarily have high cold call stats, who don't necessarily 3-bet extremely aggressive. And therefore, I think I can widen up my steal or my ISO raise option here a little bit here in the try to get a heads up pot versus recreational player. You have to keep in mind that playing a heads up pot in position versus loose passive opponents is extremely profitable. You are going to control the pot almost always here. They are not going to be that aggressive by leading or by check raising. You can do a ton of c-betting in position here and just force them out of the pot, and you can put pressure on their weak ranges. Now, keep in mind that, as I said, you want to look on the left who is sitting there. And if there are tight players, if there are players sitting who don't really 3-bet or overcall that aggressively here, you can come in for an ISO raise wider, in my opinion. Now, also, you want to keep in mind that not only regulars can sit in the blinds or at the button, but also loose passive players again. And if you have loose passive players on your left, you again want to tighten up a little bit because the chance of you playing a heads up pot or taking it down pre-flop are almost close to 0 here. So all in all, keep that in mind here. Be flexible with your ISO raising range, but be aware that it is one of the most profitable spots in the game here. You want to play as many pots as possible against these type of opponents whenever you can. Okay, let's continue here, guys, by looking into the third exploit of this episode, which is size up and value bet hard. And I want to go over another example here to illustrate you what I am talking about here. You have a hand that I played early position versus button single raise pot out of position. I flop top set here and I decide to bet half pot here. I am up against a loose passive opponent here who has a VPIP of 91 and a RFI of 9%. I only have 12 hands on him yet, but I think this person here is going to be a classical loose passive opponent. Maybe he will turn out to be a little bit more aggressive. We don't know that yet. But all in all, we do know that he wants to play a ton of hands here. Now, I flop top set and I decide to bet half pot. And I think my sizing here is not good. The reason is that my opponent has sort of made his decision already with a lot of hands in his range, whether he's going to continue versus a bet or not. Now, if I bet 4 big blinds and my opponent will call with an overpair, or a pair of 8s here, or a gut shot, or an open-ended straight draw, it is very likely that these type of players will also call if I would bet 6 or 7 big blinds here. In addition to that, these are boards where we generally also go quite often with our strong hands for a check raise. Now, I think that is not something that we want to do as often versus loose passive opponents, because they simply don't add in enough bluffs basically into their stabbing range. They have no high post-flop aggression, and therefore it's more likely that we have to start betting ourselves. But I think we have to size up more. We want to make our opponent's mistake larger, make him continue still with the same amount of hands if he decides to, but then let the mistake, make it more costly for him actually to continue there. We want to build larger pots ourselves because our opponents aren't really interested in doing so here. So betting something like 6 or 7 big blinds is way better in my opinion than going for this small sizing. So keep that in mind. Don't be too tricky against these type of opponents as they are not very bluff heavy. Play it a little bit more straightforward with your strong hands. Bet them large and just let them make the mistake here. Okay, let's move on to the next one, guys, which is the final exploit for this episode. And I think this is also something that we all sometimes forget in a sense, and that is alarm bells should go off if they show aggression. Now, what we see with these type of opponents is that they are generally extremely passive, both pre-flop as well as post-flop. But if they then suddenly come in for a raise on the flop or on the turn, you have to be aware that These players, they don't do that almost ever. And therefore their range is extremely likely to be much stronger than on average when you face a raise. The likelihood of them adding in a ton of bluffs there is much lower, and therefore you will have much easier of a decision here with a ton of hands that in your range that you did decide to bet, for example, now face a raise, but because your opponent's range is so much stronger than the average raising range, you can sometimes get away with just simply folding those hands and don't really worry too much about that because, first of all, it's not going to happen as often, and secondly, their range is much stronger than the average raising range here. So keep in mind that aggression from loose passive opponents is a sign of strength for them. They almost don't do it, so if they show up doing it, don't worry too much about it. Go ahead and continue to the next hand unless you have something that plays extremely well against a very strong range. Here's an overview with the final takeaways of today's session. We learned that we should raise first in tighter if we have loose passive opponents on the left of us. ISO raise in position when you have a good opportunity for it. Size up and value bet hard versus these opponents. Play a little bit straightforward. And lastly, alarm bells should go off if these opponents do show aggression. Okay, that's going to be it. Thank you very much for watching. This was Luke for the PLO Mastermind.